You are listening to When Therapists Watch TV, where we discuss today's buzzworthy TV shows and what they can teach us about ourselves, our relationships, and the world around us. I'm your host, Dr. Terry Bly, licensed clinical psychologist at LE Mental Health. The first half of season 1 of Shrinking really centers around all the mistakes Jimmy's making as a therapist, or the mistakes, unique choices, going rogue, whatever you want to call it. But as we see the second half of the season, it starts to become clear that really what this show is about is grief. It's about Jimmy grieving the loss of his wife. It's about his daughter grieving the loss of her mom. It's about Paul grieving his future with this diagnosis of Parkinson's. And it's about his daughter grieving their whole history together and now knowing that her dad is dying. There are so many, and that's just a few examples. So, it's easy to spend time talking about, and we have talked about some of the choices that Jimmy's making as a therapist. So you can watch the last episode we did on Shrinking to hear more about that. You can also watch a podcast that we do called the Therapist Thrival Guide, where we actually have 2 podcasts that talk about the ethics and the decisions that the therapists are making on the show. But today what I want to talk about is grief and death, and coming to terms with that, and how it can look so different for different people, and how it shows up in this show. And to do that, I've brought with me Erin Opoku. And Erin, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and say a little bit about why I asked you specifically to come on this podcast.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Opoku. I am a LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist. I have been practicing in the mental health field for about 15, 16 years. Currently, I am in a leadership role along with still working clinically as an LMFT. And I specialize in working with people in processing their grief, whether it is traumatic or just life transitions. And so I think I had so many people reach out to me when this Apple TV announced coming out with this TV show, because they knew it was like right up my alley. And so I was really excited to join Terry in these episodes to be able to let's talk about grief. Let's talk about all the different types, and how it's represented in the show. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about this. And we don't have to go into it unless it's your comfort level. But you and I also share some experiences with grief.
Very much so.
Personal experiences, not just professional. And so I think I'm going to speak for both of us, if I may, and say that this show, touches on both professional and personal aspects of grief.
Yes,
for us.
Definitely. Yeah, I am more than happy to share. That's part of, I think, even just my reason for entering into being a therapist, is that I lost my mom when I was 21. She was 42, excuse me. So it's been a few years. I'm not going to out myself in age, but that was really my prompt to get into being a therapist in the first place, and recognizing that grief is a thing, it's a process, and how our culture has really encouraged us to follow phases and stages, and how we can really help everyone, our communities, our culture, in recognizing that there's more to it than these stages that are reinforced, unfortunately.
Right, the 5 stages of grief that kind of implied that it's some sort of easy, smooth, predictable process that you then helps you move past the loss.
And it ends. There appears to be an end.
Right, and so when you experience it in real life, you start to recognize that, that's not how grief works.
No.
And I know, I have lots of clients in my office who legit did not understand. They thought it was a process, and then you get to the acceptance, and then you're like, good to go. And so they think there's something wrong with them that they're not getting to that point where it's just good forever.
Yeah.
That they're still experiencing those moments where it's not good.
Yeah.
And what's wrong with me? So with Jimmy, the show begins 1 year after his wife has died. She died suddenly in a car accident. What's your understanding about why he is still such a mess 1 year after his wife has passed away? Do you think does that strike you as like, ooh, 1 year in, man, you should be in a different place? Does it strike you as normal? Does it what was your initial impression when you saw where he was at this point?
Clinically, coming at it from a therapist perspective, right? Like, I actually thought he was like in like a natural process, right? Like in honoring what his process is, how I approach grief, how I talk to my clients about their process is really attachment based. And what I mean by that, right, is when you lose an individual to death and or for any other reason, the attachment and the strength of the attachment that you have with that thing or person that is no longer in your life impacts your grief process. And taking the time to really process through all of the feelings that are coming and how those engage and maybe be bubbling back up into other parts of your life, or could be quote unquote triggered when other transitions are happening in life. That's how I'm talking to my clients about it. That's how I practice, right? Is all about what attachment is no longer there. And how deep does that resonate within your life? Right. And so when I see Jimmy, right, like we don't get a ton of history regarding their relationship, how long they were married, but we assume that it was a good probably 15, 20 year marriage and or relationship at least, because his daughter is in their teens, right? And so that's a significant loss. They have built their life together and are raising a child together, along with their other individual things they're doing in life, right? And so seeing Jimmy a year into losing a really significant attachment, he's hitting like kind of the bottom, but recognizing that, oh, wait, through the first half of the season, I would say he's starting to recognize and come through the fog. And I think we talked a little bit about that in the other podcast, but like there's like this fog that happens for individuals because the emotional impact that the death has on the people still living, it creates like you're in this like weird life, right? Like it really shakes people. And so coming out of the fog, coming out of like almost like that delusion of holy crap, like this person is dead and they're not coming back. Like I think that's where we enter into his story.
Right. So something that I did not share yet is that, so I lost my first husband. We were going through a divorce, but then he died right at the end of that process. And then I lost my dad to a degenerative disease not quite 2 years ago. So within 5-6 years time, I had a couple of pretty significant losses. And when you mentioned the fog thing, I remember going to a vivid memory of going to the grocery store for the first time after my husband died. His name is Paul. And I remember looking around at all the people just like having this like normal life, like just going about their day. And I remember thinking, how can everyone just be normal? Like I'm in this fog and I'm in this weird, like nothing's right anymore, like nothing's normal anymore. Nothing is like, everything just felt so surreal and so off that to see all these people around me just being normal was one of the most jarring experiences I've ever had, because the disconnect between where I was at and how I was feeling about being there and how everyone else was apparently feeling about being there.
Yeah.
So when you say fog, I mean, that's kind of how I felt. Like, it felt like I was looking at the world through this weird, surreal, almost like when they portray people as like having died and they're like watching the world through this weird lens.
Yeah.
It kind of felt like that. Like I was removed from the world.
Yes.
And watching it from this like different plane of existence.
Yeah.
And just trying to figure out, how am I ever gonna like integrate myself back into this? Like, how do I ever feel like things are normal, like all these people seem to be?
Yeah.
Like, and I wonder if that's kind of what Jimmy then was going through. It's just like, I don't know how to be normal again. So I'm just gonna do all this weird stuff.
Well, and I think there's a level of hesitancy to even feel for him.
Right.
Because if he feels, he knows that, because he is a therapist, right? Like, if he allows himself to feel, he knows how intense that feeling is gonna be for him.
Isn't that kind of the funny part about being a therapist?
Yes.
It's just like the human you, and there's a therapist you that knows stuff, and you think it would help, but it actually can really not help. Sometimes it just gets in the way because you're like, oh, I know it. I know what this is gonna.
Yeah.
Where this is going.
Well, and I think personally and professionally, right? Like, I think it's about recognizing how, like, and this is also an aspect of this show, how when it gets to be too close and hits too far into home, and you're working with a client that may be experiencing something super similar, how to make sure you have those healthy boundaries in place to know that, oh wait, this is my own stuff. This is actually not what my client is bringing in with me right now, right? And so, like, knowing, like, when you are working in grief, like, we all have our own grief process and reaction and situations that we may or may not have gone through, right? But to know that we kind of have to hold ourselves accountable to make sure that we're in an okay spot.
Yeah.
To really be open and present and walk with our clients in that journey.
Which he obviously wasn't there at the beginning of the show. And I even said, even at the end of the show, I don't think he had really reconciled the therapist part of him and the part of him that's still going through all this stuff. But, you know, so I don't think he ever gets to a good place as a therapist. I'll just put that out there. But as a human, we start to see him finally do the work of the grieving. What do you think gets the ball rolling for him when it comes to getting his act together?
His love and, like, recognizing that he still needs to be a functioning human, especially for his daughter, right? Like, that's the love that I can see him having for her. And I think that's where it's a combination of him being a therapist and another human, right, kind of intersect, is when he starts to see that his daughter is actually really struggling, he goes, oh, wait a second. Like, let me start moving forward here. Like, the things that I am doing to avoid feeling the pain are actually, this is not healthy.
Right. And
this is impacting.
It's hurting my daughter.
It's hurting my, yep, exactly. And so I think I empathize and compassionately, like, to a deep level, really resonate with him going through that process to kind of go, part of his grieving process is so intertwined with just being a dad, because she's actually very triggering of some of the memories that like bring up and bubble up pain for him. And, you know, knowing as a therapist, I put my hat on and going, that relationship is like, it's great to actually help him process through that, allows him to really feel the pain of losing his wife, because he is kind of triggered when he even looks at his daughter.
So I want to ask you about something. So this isn't about shrinking, but this is related. When it comes to the kids, I've noticed, not just in my own life, but I have a number of clients talk about this, that when a father or parent seen it with fathers and mothers, I guess. When a parent dies suddenly and tragically, I've been surprised to hear so many stories about how that parent's family, rather, like in my head, I think I'd always made an assumption that they would get closer to the kids of that person to fill that void that the parent left behind. And instead, I've heard so many stories about the parents, about the extended family, the parents' family, actually distancing themselves.
Yeah.
And is that something that you've heard about? I'd never heard about this before, and it's so heartbreaking.
Yeah.
To hear these stories of families that just, and I'm wondering, like, as you're talking about, like, that the child represents that person that's lost, and it's triggering, and it's so painful. I mean, what's your understanding of why families do that?
I see that a lot actually in my practice, right? Like, and down to even just the individual, and it doesn't have to be a parental loss, really. When you experience such a large attachment loss, it changes you as a human, because that relationship also helped create you into who you are currently. And so there's that dynamic of, if I keep going down this line, it's going to continue to be triggering about that loss. But then there's also that piece where that's also the beauty of it, right? Like, that's the work that I do with my clients, is helping them see that that's actually a representation of the love that you had for that loss. So say, for instance, I'll use my personal stuff, right? Like, because the loss and death of my mother, my father was like, how am I gonna reshape my attachment with my daughter, because she is so triggering of all the qualities that I miss in my now dead wife. So it really can strengthen relationships, but people tend not to want to do that hard work. And so that's where that heartbreak comes in, and helping clients through that to recognize that you may lose a significant amount of people in your life because you change as a person, and recognize how the attachments are also going to change around you.
So when it comes to, like, the families, extended families of the person who dies, what for the kids in particular, like, what do you see, like, what are ways for those family members to, I don't want to process, to in layman's terms, get over it enough so that they can be there for the kids. You know what I mean?
You know how
like,
triggering that statement is for
I know
me.
we don't get over. I know we don't get over death, but to maybe to not let their grief and not let the pain stop them from finding a new path towards that relationship. It's going to be changed, and that change is painful, and that change involves, like we see with Jimmy, it really involves having to come face to face with that wall of fire that is like, this hurts, this loss is awful.
Yeah.
And you have to walk through that in order then to move on and be functional and have these relationships still. But how do you suggest people, like, what are your thoughts on how people can do that?
Yeah.
That's a big
Everyone
question.
needs therapy.
But, yeah.
And I love doing that family work, right? Like, and a lot of people, like, when they are living it, they actually, like, I think real life circumstances, they go, oh, like, I always went to my mom for this, or I always went for my dad for this. And that role change that happens in family dynamics and extended wise, right? This is something that I used to go to my mom for, or grandma for, or things like that. So there's conflict that starts to brew, frustration and anger, and they take it out on each other.
Oh, sure.
So one, family therapy, always have to put that plug in. And I think the other piece is, like, honoring the individual that has died, right? How can we continue a legacy, right, of let's talk about this person. Let's talk about how amazing they were and all the things they used to do and why that attachment was so strong.
Yeah.
Because individuals can get that need met in other ways. But
Get which need met?
Lots of needs, any need.
The thing that they went to that parent to or that person to.
Yes.
Whatever that person was for them in terms of the needs they met and the role they played.
Yeah.
Figuring out how do I honor that and also now find new ways to get those needs met.
Yeah.
Honor that this person was that to me and that will never not have been true. And now I also need to see how it, and there's going to be some anger there, right? Now they're not there.
Yeah.
And so how do I establish these new
connections.
attachments
to get my needs met, right? Because it can, and that's part of why I personally struggle when I hear people talk about stages, because there are some truths and feelings intertwined into those stages. So I don't want to totally dismiss them, right? Like they're there for a reason. We grasped onto them as a culture for a reason, because there's parts of it that do resonate with us. Being that there's an anger stage. Yep. Are we going to be angry? Do we have a right to be angry? Heck yes, you do. You get to be frustrated that this person died. You get to be frustrated at the circumstances that surrounded the death, the diagnosis, all of those things. You get to feel those emotions, and that grief therapy really involves or surrounds how can I still express those emotions and rewire myself to get my needs met in other ways. And that's complex.
Yeah.
Because you have to kind of disassemble what that relationship was and figure out what you can validate and honor for yourself to get those needs met. And then who else in my circle can I utilize to get those needs met now?
So Sean was is the client that comes to live with him.
Yes.
Yeah. So Sean and Jimmy, one of their first conversations, Sean talks he has his own grief process. He went to combat, he was in combat and saw people die and, is trying to recover from that. And he talks about the before and after. And Jimmy says, yeah, I get it. He's talking about there's my life before this stuff happened. And now there's the after and kind of some anger that the before can't happen anymore. That before you had this huge loss, this change like you talk about.
Yeah.
There's this change in my life. And man, I remember how I felt before. And I like that better than how I feel now. I like how I thought about my life better before this horrible loss than it is now. And being angry and fighting in some way than the now. The fighting that this is different, fighting that this is, I want that back. I want that, which I suspect is what Jimmy is flailing around trying to do with the drugs and
all the things,
the girls and whatever is trying to feel the before again.
Yeah.
Is that something that you, how do you think people work through that? Because I do get it. There is that before a horrible loss and an after, and you are changed, and there is that wishing you could be that before again.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that piece that they talked about?
Yeah, so when I'm working with clients, and it doesn't just occur when there is a traumatic loss, right? I think it is again, coming from that attachment viewpoint and how I practice, it really, I work with clients when there is a significant attachment loss in general. And that can be anything or anyone, right? But I think being able to help people honor being angry and also coming to a level of acceptance. Yes, I know that's another.
How do you honor being angry?
That's a really good question. I think it looks different for everyone, right? Having your feelings validated, right? Like,
So
to know it's okay.
I'm angry and I'm not going to fight being angry. I'm just going to let myself be angry.
Yes. And expressing that in healthy ways, right? And with Sean, it's a little bit of that anger expression was not being expressed well. It was being taken out on others, and he was easily triggered into anger. But being able to contain that anger and have intent placed behind when I'm going to express that anger. I think that's where, as a therapist, I see him moving towards that, right? When he brings him to the boxing ring, right? He was helping him try to contain and place intent around the expression of anger. That wasn't out there, unfortunately. Like, but from a therapist perspective, I could see what he was doing, right? And so it's really working with the client to help them, one, even identify the emotion. Many humans don't recognize their emotion or don't know where they're feeling it. And so,
or why they're feeling it.
And
they
why
don't
they're
understand
feeling
what's
it.
going on. Why am I so angry all the time?
Yeah. And so, you know, it's helping. That's kind of that first step of when you're engaging into therapy of really, what am I feeling? What am I relating it to? Helping someone and help you process through all of those dynamics. That's what therapy is to me, right? And so I don't think there's one answer. There's not a one go-to thing. You know, I say that to clients all the time. I'm like, I could give you a total list full of coping skills to healthily express all of the emotions that you're holding in right now or shoving down or whatever. But it has to be authentic for you, and it needs to resonate, and there needs to be intent behind it.
Why do you think it's so important to, or maybe you didn't say this, but if it seems like it's important to go through that anger phase of grief. And
if there's an anger phase, Terry.
Okay, so what you're telling me is so I'm sensing that you're suggesting maybe not everybody has to be angry.
Yeah.
Which is important to know, right? Like if you're a friend or whatever, you know somebody who's going through a grieving process and you're not seeing them feel angry, it doesn't mean they're not doing it right, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, I think about some of my other clients that I've worked with, and, you know, I've had clients come in to say, I don't think I'm grieving right.
Right.
And I'm like,
well, because we've got
in whose regard?
Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Is that those 5 stages that we're all supposed to go through?
Yes.
Okay.
Those are the identified stages.
But you're saying that like none of these are requirements.
No. And you get to feel all of those things at once or never feel them. And that's where, again, how I practice of, let's identify what you're feeling.
Yeah.
Is it tied to grief? Is it tied to yes, no, maybe, right? But let's kind of pull that apart and kind of go, okay, wait, is this tied in, or am I doing the thing and I don't even realize it?
Yeah.
Right? And that is a possibility. Right? Because my belief is that it really has to coincide with the attachment that you had with the loss.
Something else that I think is important for people to understand about grief, and I didn't learn about this more until I was going through my own grieving process, is, you know, we think of grief as like it spikes right after the person dies, and then over time it kind of does this gradual, you know, reduction in pain or intensity, but really it's more like, it's like this. It's this, it feels more like, well, at least the way I experience is it felt more like, you know, it hurts long time and then it starts to hurt less, but then you get reminded of that person or something comes up and then it's just like a wave hits you and like brings you to your knees, and then you're in a ton of pain. And really what happens over time is those moments just don't last as long, or maybe they don't happen as often.
Yep.
But the pain doesn't, I mean, there can still be some moments of really intense pain even years after
Yeah.
somebody. And I don't think we are very transparent about that. I don't think we talk about that enough. So I think people are really surprised
Yeah.
when they're a year or 2 or 5 or more 10 years in, and they can still be just brought to their knees by the pain of that loss.
Yeah. And there's some really great resources out there, right? One that I'm thinking of specifically, and I can't give credit to who created it because there's multiple sources out there and versions of it. So I don't know where it originated. However, it is a video and a picture of a box, and there is a ball, and it looks like a ball of yarn, right? And the strings on the ball make it like that represents the complexity of grief, right? And so they really talk about how when a loss happens, the ball is consumed and within this box, right?
So the ball is almost as big as the box?
As big as the box, right? And as we move forward in life happens, years happen, things like that, right? The ball never changes. The size of the ball never changes. It's actually the box that changes.
Really?
As
Interesting.
the human that we are continues to grow, because we do naturally in age, in experiences, in life, as we continue to move through, our life experiences continue to shape and grow us as beings. And so what happens is that the ball, right, when it consumes this little box, it's constantly touching the edges, and that is painful, and it hurts. When the box is bigger, the ball doesn't touch the edges as much as it's floating around, right?
But when it does, it feels...
It's still as painful.
Yeah. Right. That fits.
And so I love that example because I think that's really representative of the ball is still as big as the ball ever was, right? And when you go through life, there's gonna be times where it's gonna bring you to your knees. So bringing it back to Jimmy and what he's going through, his box and the ball inside of his box is huge.
Yeah.
And as the season goes on,
it's huge.
Yes.
Huge for his daughter too.
Yep. And they show a little bit more of her like going to therapy, even though it's with Paul.
It's seeing Paul in the park,
It's kind of off script therapy maybe.
Yeah.
Right? But it really is, Paul giving her suggestions of how to like identify that emotion, express that emotion,
honor that emotion. Yeah.
Right? And even just allowing for that once a week time that they're kind of meeting, right? To even talk about the loved one, because that is really that start of that process. If we can talk about it, if we can talk about the person that we lost, that is then going to transition into us talking about them and continuing to talk about them, and it'll shift into the love that we had about them.
Right, because talking about them helps us integrate them into our story, into who we are, rather than keeping it. I've got a number of clients who lost a parent, and the other parent wouldn't, there was the kind of almost an unspoken rule of we don't talk about that person anymore. And you can see the damage that does when now it's just silent. We don't talk about them. We don't we just move on. We just have to move on. They're gone. And so we just need to get over it and move on.
I think a perfect example of this in the show is actually when Gabby goes to the art studio, and where that was her trying to move on from the grief she was experiencing from
her divorce.
The divorce. And that was her kind of I'm going to try this. I'm going to like engage into this and recognize that this marriage played a part in my life.
Right.
And
Oh, man, yeah.
I can honor the place that I played in his life, and we're not there anymore.
You bring up a good point that with divorce, there's a grieving process that we really struggled to know how to talk about.
Yeah. And I think I could talk for hours on all the different types of grief, but I think that's one of the reasons that I love this show is that it allows for you to see different grief perspectives, right? Types, however you want to, like in our therapy world, we can like identify those, label them, right? But Paul is going through grief, not even so much around the rebuilding the relationship with his daughter, but he has to process through the grief and the potential loss that is upcoming because of his diagnoses. Obviously his neighbors, Liz and you had the name earlier, and I forget. Frank.
Maybe?
They only say his name a couple times because they're not called out. But they are also going through a level of grief and loss because of the connection they had with their neighbor.
And their son.
And there's,
just empty nesters now, and there's grief there, and
And even with her husband retiring, there's a level of grief that your career is a huge part of your life, and to not be practicing anymore, whatever career you have chosen, people go through a grieving process around that. And we don't talk about it enough, I don't think, in our culture and our society. And I am definitely a proponent of let's talk about it. Because then we can place a level of love and meaning to what we no longer have present in our life.
Well, and we can't weave that stuff into our sense of who we are without talking about it. And that's how you move forward, right? You don't move on, you just move forward with that stuff that happened, with those losses, with those things that you won't get to have anymore, be it a career or a marriage or that person in your life. To move forward in a healthy way means weaving that in as part of your story and not trying to pretend that it wasn't. Like with divorce, people try to pretend that they weren't married to that person.
Right.
They don't want to talk about them. They don't want to look at them. They don't want to have any, and that's healthy for a period of time while you're kind of healing. But at some point, I think Gabby was onto something. Like, how do I honor that this person was a big part of my life for some period of time, and they shaped me. In some way, they shaped me. And if I pretend they didn't exist, then I'm never going to really benefit from the lessons I got from that relationship. Even from it ending by divorce, by death. We really need to cross that go over that hurdle of like going through that pain of the loss of that relationship, but also then getting to that point of like, how did this person impact me? And how did they shape me? And how can I, again, we're using that word, how do I honor that as I move forward? Which then brings me to the last question about the grief stuff is, Jimmy's daughter, Alice, gets upset with him because he took off his wedding ring and he seems to be in a different place than she is. And she gets really mad at him, which I imagine happens a lot in these kinds of situations. Where one person is like, I miss them, but I think I'm ready to start. I'm ready to not be frozen in place with this loss, and someone else in that family system or whatever is not there, and they're mad, right? It looks like you're forgetting, that Alice, are you just gonna like leave mom behind? Are you just gonna forget her? Are you just gonna? So, what suggestions or how do you talk to people where that's happening, where they're just in different places?
Well, and I think again, coming from how I practice, it's all about the attachment, right? And so when I'm doing the family work, I really, encourage people to look at things from the other person's perspective within their family dynamic, right? And I think Jimmy actually does a really beautiful job of like conflict resolution, if you want to throw words out there, right? But like really meeting his daughter where she's at and saying, you know what, I'm ready to take my ring off. And he boxed up all of her clothes and things like that. And at the last couple, spoiler alert, episodes, he brings it back out for her.
Yeah.
Let's go through this. Let's talk about mom. Let's talk about her special shoes that she used to wear. And he excused himself from that. I think it was just her and then
Her and Sean.
and Sean.
Yeah. Messed up. But, and also.
Right. Because Sean was the right person to be there because he didn't have an attachment to her mom. And so he could honor being there, ask questions, prompt, and hear the stories that, you know, Jimmy had heard already. He knew the connection to these specific items. So I think he actually did a really great job at helping his daughter kind of start to move through
And
some
I
of that.
cried.
It was
that episode
so
made me cry. I think that's
emotional.
the one I watched in the airplane and just like.
It is, right? Like,
Don't watch this show in an airplane, not the last few episodes. If you have anything with grief, like loss, person in your life, like it's hard to, like, it's so, like, they did such a good job showing that it's like, oh my God. I just
to the pit of my stomach kind of like, and that's where I feel that, you know, like that connection with some of the things because of my personal loss. I know, and I've been in those shoes to be able to go, nope, that is my mom's sweatshirt that my dad was ready to pack up and give to Goodwill. And I was like, what the, I'm going to keep this until I'm ready to get rid of it. Right. And his attachment to that was, she had plenty of sweatshirts. Right. But it wasn't that for me. Right. And that's what Jimmy does a really great job at, of saying Alice needs to talk about her.
Yeah.
Because I haven't been able to hear about her
right.
Up until now.
Yeah.
And so, everyone is going to have their own process. And I think that's, again, what I loved about those last couple episodes is that it started to honor that.
Yeah.
And even though Alice had been going to these quote unquote sessions with
Pseudo-therapy
Paul,
sessions.
you know, she was still not in that spot to get rid of the stuff, you know,
and maybe never is.
And never
like,
will
might
be.
want to hold on to a lot of her mom's stuff. I know my
Definitely
girls
not.
have a lot of their dads. Like, they'll keep whatever they're given of their dads. They'll keep it.
Yep. As I fiddle with my ring on my hand.
Right.
Right. Like, we find ways to be able to stay connected to the individual that represented the love that we had. Right. So the ring on my hand is really my grandma's ring. And it's my mom's birthstone and my birthstone in it. Right. And so being able to have this, knowing that that is my attachment, every time I look down into it, it reminds me of what it is. Right. And what it represents and that meaning making. So the last episode, again, spoiler alert, where she chooses to wear her mom's shoes, I was bawling my eyes out because I knew what that represented to her. And even though it was painful for Jimmy to see and to watch, he honored and knew how important that was to his daughter.
That was an amazing moment.
It was beautiful.
He could be heartbroken to see her look like, I mean, she must have looked like a spitting image of his wife. To see her and have it go, like, just be like a knife.
Yep.
And also be like, okay, that's what she needs.
Yeah.
Oof. Gets me all choked up. Just think about it.
It is.
It's so like.
That's the power and the emotion that resides in grief, right? And so honoring that, and that's why when I'm working with clients, it's such an honor to sit in that pain with them, because I resonate with that. I know that feeling. I know how intense that can be, but I also know that we continue to grow from it. We can continue to have the pain that maybe this ring sometimes evokes. The love is also there at the same time.
Yeah.
And seeing clients on the other side of that and really fully accepting themselves and that the person that they lost is then still part of them. It's beautiful.
Yeah. They really capture that well.
Yep.
That all the complexities of a grieving process and how it is different. I'm guessing that even though everyone doesn't need to go through all 5 of those stages to grieve, what I'm hearing though is that maybe everyone does need opportunity to talk about that loss. That might be a critical component for maybe everybody, safe to say.
Yeah.
That like you've got to be able to talk about it. You just have to let yourself process it.
Yeah.
So that because when we wall off stuff, that's where trauma happens, right? It's when we just try to wall it off and like we don't allow it to move past that initial emotional pain.
Yep.
Then we never get to move it into that integrated
Part
wisdom, growth,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it, part of us, if it just gets locked into that pain place.
Yeah. Right? Like when I'm working with clients on it, there's many sessions that I actually don't even talk about their loved one. Or depending on the client, I'll honor saying, hey, we're going to talk about this today. Are you ready? And they get to have the right to say, nope, we're not talking about that today. Or yes, let's talk about that. Because like, obviously that's why they're coming in to see me, but everyone is at their own process.
Yeah.
So
With Paul and his daughter, as we get ready to wrap up, I just want to touch on this because this is this is a separate thing, and because there's a grief of the past and a grief of what's coming on the horizon there.
yeah.
And I just wanted to get your take on how you understand what Paul is going through, because I have some thoughts and feelings about Paul, and I know we had a little group chat with one of our colleagues who also had a strong reaction, but very different from mine. He had a very negative reaction to how Paul is handling his own, diagnosis and his relationship with his daughter. But I'm wondering, what is your take on, like, what his daughter's going through, what he's going through, and how they're it's bringing up stuff from the past.
Yeah. I personally, like from my personal humanistic side of me, gets exactly what his daughter is trying to do, right? Like she has longed for that relationship.
But hasn't known how to say it.
Exactly. And she's at that spot of there was an attachment built with her dad and life got in the way. And I think she actually does you don't see this and they don't film it, but I think she's done a pretty good job at like being okay with knowing that life got in the way and circumstances got in the way. And knowing
but she still resents him.
There is
resentment she feels like he always put his career over her.
Yeah. But I think I think her justification was really that it's because you were across the states from me, right? Like I can't remember exactly how far, across states. And she had never really been able to resolve any of that.
Yeah.
And that is pretty deep in her, right? Like that
little girl, and you almost see like a little girl on her face when she's
and
talking to him
part
about
of her
that stuff.
even reaction to some of the things that Paul is attempting to do is saying, no, just give me, like my gut reaction is, no, I'm not moving with you
into your
and
guest house.
I'm not, no way. I'm
Yeah.
an independent human and I've been functioning by myself. And he, like her reaction to that is very teenager-ish.
Yes, exactly.
Like, fine, I'm done talking to you.
All or nothing. You either do what I want or,
Exactly.
I'm storming out.
That was that little girl in her, right?
The hurt little girl. Hurt girl.
Yeah, right? And there needs to be some relationship mending. And I think that's what Paul is actually trying to honor before uprooting himself to go and live with her.
Yep.
Right? And so I think Paul, just as a human, he has to go through his own process because it was kind of like he didn't trust that his relationship was strong enough for her to even suggest that.
Yeah.
And so I think it was very...
And he wasn't ready to move to that stage of the end of his life either. He wasn't ready to give up his independence. And I mean, that represents a lot for him.
Yeah.
Sort of like for people who move into assisted living or, you know, whatever, like it represents like, well, that's where I'm going to go to die then, you know, like, and that's, I think, a big step too, that he was trying to figure out how to navigate for himself. He still had this practice, he still had a job, he still has a career and stuff. And then to, you know, moving in with her would be the end of all of that abruptly.
Yeah. And I think that is his own grief, right? Of recognizing of, like, you see bits and pieces of his own grief in this, you know, terminal diagnosis, you know, it may be 5 years down the road, but
it's going to be a series of losses until then.
Yeah, right? Like his inability to drive, right? Like that's that first little taste of him starting his process and acceptance of this diagnosis.
Which I watched my dad go through, and man, it is hard to watch, and I can only imagine what it's like to experience.
Yeah.
Little grieving, like it's just grieving over and over and over and over and over again. Yeah. And how, like, just the toll it can take on a person, and then also with their relationships, and anyway, it's just, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to seeing how that evolves for him in the next season, because I also, like, we just don't see stuff like that portrayed very often. Let alone by Harrison Ford. So
which is
I'm
amazing.
excited to see Harrison Ford tackle this. I mean, he's aging himself, right? Like he's such an amazing person to be showing us that. So, well, I'm being told that we need to wrap up for some reason.
I could probably talk for hours on this.
I could too, and you're like, this is the first one where I cried. I actually cried on this one. I don't know how I feel about that.
I got you.
But the grief thing, like that, like I said, that hits deep, and I mean, this is like, I can get choked up. It shows like you can be rolling along in your life just fine, but that grief stuff can just get you out of left field.
It's powerful.
It's powerful. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on here, and as always, like we could just keep going and going and going about this, but I really appreciate all the insight that you brought to the show today.
Thank you for having me. I loved it.
I will have you back on again.
Sounds good. Season 2.
All right, season 2, exactly. We need to come back and talk about that.
Wonderful.
All right,
Thank you.
This episode of When Therapists Watch TV was produced by Ellie Mental Health. Miranda Barker is the managing producer. Jesse Stenbroughton is the technical director. Our production team also includes Julia Galloway, Lucas Mooney, and Tu Pham. A special thanks to Lucas Fellini, Nick Seeger, and Mel Springer. I'm Dr. Terry Bly. Thanks for listening.